won't defeat us. They were wrong. I managed to hold my own, defeating one of the architects. I did both.
Oh, no. There we
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone
Hello.
hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic,
There you
fantastic.
go.
So I see some familiar faces. I see some people I haven't met. I'm very glad to have all of you here with me. Um, this is the beginning of Judaism 101, and it is perhaps important to note that this is going to be a very mobile experience in the sense that it's going to be broadcast on Zoom every time we do it. Um, and when I am in Knoxville, I will be at Heska Muna, and you can come in person, but we'll always have a Zoom option regardless. Otherwise, I may be somewhere else. I am, as you might be able to tell, even though I kind of blurred it out a little bit, I'm in my car. So, I guess partially to demonstrate to all of you that you can log into this wherever you like. So, whether you're in the comfort of your own home or somewhere else, we're glad to welcome you. Um, for those who may not know me, I'm Adam Rosenbaum. I am the rabbi of Heska Muna Synagogue in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I know since I began working for the synagogue a little more than a year ago, there have been some queries about how best to connect those who want to learn things about Judaism for the very first time or who need a refresher. And so trying to figure out what to do Judaism 101 became a bit of a challenge. Um, and what I settled on was the idea that we would do Sundays at 10 a.m., hopefully a good time for, certainly a number of you. And then, however, if you don't wish to actually participate in uh, at the time in which the class is being held, you may be able to. I don't know if you got a notification, but I'm also live streaming this on YouTube, and I have a YouTube page which is Rabbi Adam J. Rosenbaum. And if you want to go back and review what we talked about, or if for whatever reason being on Zoom isn't an option for you, and you would rather, just sort of go the YouTube route, that's certainly fine. I am not really sure how to interact with people who are simply logging in on YouTube. I can't interact with you live, but at least you'd be able to watch the recording, and I figured that I'll keep the recording up on my YouTube page going forward, and I'll share those links on my synagogue emails as we go. Um, I know that's a lot of housekeeping to start with. I guess the only other thing to mention at this moment, or maybe a couple things, rabbis, we always have an extra thing or two to say. So Sundays at 10 a.m. from 10 to 11 is the time where we will meet. And it actually works pretty well with the schedules of the holidays, the fall holidays that we have this year. In other words, we don't have any fall holidays that actually fall on Sundays. So we're actually in pretty good shape in terms of being able to do this on a weekly basis. Um, how long this class will go is going to honestly depend on the level of interest and the potential journeys that people are taking. Which leads me to the next point, which is frankly that, obviously this is open to all. Anyone who wants to join, please do. This is, I envision at least a vehicle for people who are considering converting to Judaism, or to be able to to either review things that we've already talked about or to explore new ideas. So I would say if that is something that you are in the midst of doing or considering doing, obviously it is 1000% up to you whether you want to do that. We are not a religion that proselytizes in any way. But if that is something that you wish to pursue, I invite you to contact me separately from this. We could obviously have a conversation if that is what you want to do, but I leave that in your hands if that is something that interests you. Um, so that's essentially what we're starting. Sundays at 10, and we'll kind of go from there. Does anyone have any questions at this moment? I guess the only other thing to mention is that if you're sitting here going, wait a second, I didn't know I was going to be on YouTube. If that is a concern for you, you are welcome to, turn your camera off and what have you. If you don't want to be seen or if you need to, change your name on this. Everybody has different ways of approaching internet uh, security and safety. It all depends on your comfort level. I don't judge on how you do that. So I just want to make sure that you are aware of that. Um, the and okay, I think there's one more thing before we start, which is that um, I'm doing this off of my iPad. I will be sharing my screen in pretty short order. Um, I may The way it works with an iPad is that when I share my screen, I'm not able to see all of you at the same time, to see the little boxes in which you appear. So when and if you have questions, especially when you share the screen, either send something in the chat and I'll try to address it as soon as I can, or frankly, you can interrupt me. I won't be offended. So just feel free to jump in because again, I might not be able to see that you are trying to get my attention when that happens. And look, there'll be other times where I'm using a typical laptop and I would be better able, but just please don't feel shy about jumping in. As we often know from different classes, you might sit here going, oh shoot, I can't ask this question. Everybody else knows the answer to this, and I'm just wasting everybody's time. Most of the time, if there's a question you have, it's something that at least somebody else is wondering about. So you're doing everybody a favor. You're doing all of us a favor by asking. So please don't be shy on that. So all right. So one of the big challenges in trying to figure out how to begin an introductory level Judaism exploration is how do you start? Where do you start? There are so many different ways. And the way that I've chosen is a way that I have often started in initial conversations with potential converts. And it's not necessarily the place that you would expect, but I but I want to explain why I do. Heskamuna is a conservative synagogue. Judaism, in so many ways, is the same across the board, but there are numerous ways in which approaches to Judaism vary in important ways, depending on whether you are observing in a manner consistent with the conservative movement, or the Orthodox movement, or the Reform movement, or some kind of hybrid that might not be an organized movement, but um, but still is all, a very legitimate form of Jewish expression. So I entitled this on YouTube, this first class, Starting at Sinai, because as my professor at Jewish Theological Seminary, my philosophy professor there, the late Rabbi Neil Gilman, as he explained, it really starts with Mount Sinai. Obviously, that's not the beginning of the Torah, that's not the beginning of the Jewish story, but the beginning of the formal introduction of the relationship between God and the people Israel. That is the, to borrow a football term, that's the kickoff event. That's where it begins. And the way that we understand what Judaism will mean in our lives depends to a certain extent on how we as individuals and then as groups as well understand what exactly happened at Mount Sinai and what its significance is. Now, we can certainly talk about the events specifically at Mount Sinai. We can, we could potentially go through verse by verse. Just to be clear, what I'm talking about is essentially the what is described in Exodus 19 and Exodus chapter 20, when the Israelites have um, uh, been liberated from slavery in Egypt. They have journeyed over the course of 7 weeks from slavery in Egypt to this area in the wilderness known as Sinai, and they are at the foot of a mountain. And God explains to Moses that something big is about to happen, that there's going to be something really important. And Moses then tells the people, okay, you need to prepare, you need to get ready for this. This is going to be, this is going to be like, very important. And then essentially you see the world's first recorded laser show. I mean, it's not lasers, but it's, thunder and lightning and just apparently uh, something that is often described as synesthesia, in which our senses get all mixed up, in which, for instance, you would taste colors and you would see sound. That's what we're talking about with synesthesia. That's essentially what is happening when then God speaks directly to all the people. And that's an important point. God is not speaking at that moment through the intermediary of Moses or his brother Aaron. God is speaking directly to the people, according to this text. And over the course of the next handful of verses in the Exodus chapter 20, you have what we now refer to as the Ten Commandments. It doesn't say, oh, hey, it's God, everyone. Let me give you the Ten Commandments now. There's not an introduction in that way, but essentially that's what happens. The people, the Israelites, after hearing the Ten Commandments, basically freak out. They are shocked. They are amazed. They are also fearful. They notice that the force of God is so awesome that they fear that listening directly to God any more than they already did might endanger their lives. And the people say to Moses, don't do that again. Let's, how about, can you talk to us? Can you convey what God says? Because this was really, really intense. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And that's essentially the story. Now, what I want to talk about is what the story means in the larger sense of what it means to be Jewish and how we express ourselves Jewishly. Before I go to sharing my screen, are there any questions or comments about what I've explained regarding Mount Sinai or anything else you're wondering about? And it's okay if you don't know, or if you feel like we're okay, then here we go. Let me share my, let's see. Okay, give me just a moment here as we go into here. Okay. Um, could I ask a favor? Could somebody unmute and tell me whether you see the screen as I've shared it?
I can see screen and numbers 1 through 4 across the top.
Okay. Okay. So
So
are you able to see like a sort of like a table below that?
yes,
I see the table. I don't see the numbers, but I see the table: Orthodox, Conservative 1, Conservative 2.
Okay. And then a bunch of boxes that follow that. Okay. All
Yes.
right. I'm glad you're able to see that, and I will certainly go through some of these things. Some of the in terms of these boxes, in terms of this graph, not everyone is going to be so vital for us to look at now. And I also want to note that this graph is it's I wouldn't say it's an old document, but it's a document that was put together, I would say, I don't know, like 35, 40 years ago. Um, is it a perfect description of um, Orthodox, conservative, and reform as it stands right now? It's not, but I think it's a good jumping off point at the very least. So that's where we're at. Um, and so this was actually from a book by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, called "Our Ancestors to Our Descendants," which is a very good introduction to the conservative movement. But what is certainly helpful here is that we go into Orthodox conservative reform and also multiple expressions of the conservative movement. You see that there are boxes on the left that say conservative 1, conservative 2, conservative 3, conservative 4. Those aren't official designations. There's nobody out there saying, "Oh, are you a conservative 1 Jew or a conservative 3 Jew?" Those aren't designations in terms of people's affiliations. What they are essentially just different approaches within the conservative movement. So it's nothing formal. It's not like you have to be declare that you're a 1 or a 2 or a 4 or whatever it is.
Hey, Rabbi.
Please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Will had his hand up.
Please. Will, go ahead.
Yeah, for some reason, when you set this up, it's showing one of the little, screen boxes. You start off with a black one, and it was shifting to Mark to Catherine, then I guess me, because it's showing black on that screen. Yeah, that's it. It just filled it up.
Okay, so that's that's a big screen there.
Yeah, it's showing. I think it's showing my screenshot with if when I'm talking, because it's just got a silhouette instead of a picture.
Okay, so I'm gonna do this a different way, because I really do appreciate the feedback because again we're all trying to figure this out. All right, so now let's hold on a second. So I'm gonna do this a different way. Give me just a moment. Thank you for your patience, everybody. I really appreciate it. Okay. Let's head back here. We're going to now. Okay, how is this, everyone?
That's better for
Fixed.
me.
It
Yeah.
fixed it.
I still
Okay.
see whoever's speaking pops up
Yeah,
next to it,
yeah.
but it doesn't stay up.
Okay. All right. Well, look, I appreciate it. I'm glad this is better. Again, thank you for thank you for your patience on this, certainly. So here's the graph. Um, can we send out materials by email later? I'd be happy to. And what, by the way, in terms of communicating things, um, I guess there are a couple of ways to do it. One would be is I may be able to link in the YouTube description of this. I may be able to link documents from there. That's one possibility, but also what I definitely can do is I encourage you, if you haven't already, to get our Heska Muna emails, and I would just contact the synagogue office if you don't do that already, if you haven't gotten those emails already. And I send out an email every Friday, which has a video about, thoughts, going into Shabbat. And what I'm planning on doing is putting the link to this, to this on YouTube. And I can also link the articles, link getting the material. So, Mark, thank you for the suggestion. And yeah, that I will work on that as well. Okay. So here we have a graph, and hopefully it's visible. And again, the conservative 1, 2, 3, 4 is these are not formal titles of affiliation. They are just different approaches to the ideas. Now, when I talked about the question of what happened at Sinai, that's really going to be in number 2. Right, where it says the nature of revelation. The nature of revelation. Revelation. What does that mean? Revelation, comes from the word reveal, and the idea is that the Ten Commandments are revealed in at during the story of Mount Sinai. But let's look at Sinai as sort of a larger idea. The larger idea of Sinai is essentially the question of what happened. Now we're going to a literal question, as in what actually occurred, what actually took place at Mount Sinai. In other words, do you agree with the idea that thousands of years ago, at a literal place, at a literal mountain called Sinai, a man named Moses, who literally existed, went up on that mountain, and hundreds of thousands, at least, of Israelites were literally at the foot of the mountain, and God literally spoke the words as recorded in Exodus. I know I'm using the word literally a lot, but I mean to, because that's one of the ways to look at it, in that what happened at Mount Sinai was an historical event, accurately accurately recorded in the Torah, in the 19th and 20th chapters of the book of Exodus. That is one way to understand it, that all of this was literal truth. If you believe that, right? If that is your understanding of what happened at Mount Sinai, exactly what the Torah tells us happened. If that is your belief, philosophically at least, it would make the most sense for you to live life as an Orthodox Jew. Okay? Philosophically, it would make the most sense for you to do that. Because if you go further, and you know what, I'm going to try to, hold on a second, I'm going to try to use my pencil. to kind of. All right. So let's say you agree with this idea. All right. That the Torah, including both the written and oral traditions, consists of the exact words of God. He gave it all as one piece at Sinai, and we have those words in hand. In other words, it's exactly as it is. If you believe that, then the question goes, who exactly makes the rules? Well, God makes the rules, right? Right? Because if that's exactly what happened, if God said, all right, I am God, you shall have no other gods before me. If, observe the Sabbath, do not murder, do not steal, don't commit adultery, etc. If you if you go through, it's like, I am God, you have to follow these things. And if you that happened, if you have faith that happened, then that's what we have to do, right? Philosophically, at least. Fair enough? Okay. And then the question is there any way to evolve or change rules from God? Basically, no. Essentially, no. Um, Now, they list a couple of exceptions where maybe there are new situations, but even there's a belief that, well, God talked about that in Mount Sinai too. It just wasn't written down. That's one, that's one way of looking at it. And then there's also, okay, well, there are rabbis who have interpreted and explained the laws, and sometimes there are disagreements about the right ways, the most accurate ways um, like which rabbi is right, which rabbi isn't right, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond that, it's like you don't just change things that are Torah if, again, your belief is that everything happened the way it was described. Okay. Fair enough?
Rabbi,
Please.
the way that that is written, it what it says is that the Torah, including historical events that occurred after Sinai, were presented in written form at Sinai. Is that the Orthodox interpretation?
I mean, that according to Rabbi Dorf, yes. Now, and I should note that if one were exploring Orthodox Judaism more fully, I'm not the best person to talk to about it, in the sense that I'm not an Orthodox rabbi, and I have not, lived full time in that society. I've had a decent amount of exposure to it, but an Orthodox rabbi would quite likely be able to explain better than I can. But that is my understanding: is that there were things revealed about the future at Mount Sinai, and they have some different explanations about why that's the case. But yeah, essentially that's it. Okay. Other questions? Okay. All right. So next, now I want to jump to reform. All right. And with reform, you have this idea called, like, in other words, with the question of what happened at Mount Sinai, reform answers a different way. They go to something called progressive revelation. meaning the way it's described here, the Torah is God written by human beings. As time goes on, we get to understand God's will better and better. Meaning, did God write the Torah? No. Human beings wrote it down based on their understanding of God's will. Now, as things progress, we understand God's will better and better. In other words, the things that God would have said 3,500 years ago are probably not the same things that God would say now. This is kind of I mean, I don't know if you would say it's 180 degrees opposite, but it is kind of opposite to what Orthodox would say. In other words, what happened in Mount Sinai? Nothing literally happened in Mount Sinai. Nothing actually happened there. It was a human written, the Torah essentially is a human written document that describes a scene from a mountain called Sinai that reflects values, or at least values from that time period, as to what it means to fulfill God's will. So nothing actually happened in Mount Sinai. Now, what does that mean in terms of how we observe Judaism? Essentially, we have to follow moral laws, right? And keep in mind here, by the way, Reform Judaism is saying that the Torah was not written by God. There is still a belief in God. All right, I want to make sure that that's understood. There is still a belief in God. All right, moral laws come from God. So, in other words, you can't say, well, nothing happened in Mount Sinai, so that law about not murdering people doesn't apply. No, you still shouldn't murder people. You still shouldn't do that. When it comes to ethics, those are godly ideas. But when it comes to ritual laws, well, we don't really have to deal with that. And, as it describes in this box that I circled, rabbinic laws that the rabbis determined sort of separately from the Torah, were intended for only specific periods, only for specific time periods in which those rabbis lived. So what does that mean about how we observe? Every individual decides both what and how to obey when it comes to ritual law. What happened in Mount Sinai? Nothing that we can prove. And therefore, we have to be moral people. But in terms of ritual, we have choices. It's completely up to us. That, I would say, is, again, I'm not a Reform rabbi, so I, might not be able to describe this perfectly, but that's a general understanding of how we would describe Reform Judaism and what that means. Okay? Questions up to this point? Again, feel free to just shout them out if you need.
fall, would they be truly Orthodox, or is there another subcategory?
I'm sorry, I missed the very first part of that
Uh,
question.
okay, where would Chabad fall? Would they fall as Orthodox, or are they a separate?
Yeah, Chabad, I would say, like philosophically, would be pretty much aligned with the Orthodox description. Um, there are certainly differences between Chabad and mainstream Orthodoxy. There are differences, but as a I mean, but in terms of like this overall question of what happened in Mount Sinai and what authority do rules have, they're pretty much aligned. So yeah. Okay, other questions. All right, great.
I have maybe
Please.
one,
Yeah.
maybe. Um, how do you tell the difference between moral laws, ethical laws, and laws that are, according to this belief, that are not applicable anymore?
How do you tell the difference? So that's a big question, but a good one. Um, Moral laws, I would say. So there's a concept, which the Hebrew description of it is ben adam lamakom and ben adam lechavero. So what does that mean? Ben adam lamakom is rules between human beings and our relationship with God, and then there's ben adam lechavero, which means human beings and our relationship to other human beings. Those are two basic categories of Jewish law. In other words, what we are, uh, how we are interacting with God and how we are interacting with other people. So that's another way to describe sort of moral laws and ritual laws, meaning that the moral laws, um, are essentially the laws in terms of how we treat other people. Ritual laws are generally how we are um, how we are relating to God. So I would say that's another way to compare. The other way I would describe it is, okay, in terms of laws that, um, uh, that don't necessarily apply anymore. Um, that I think that is very much a matter of interpretation. Which laws apply anymore, which laws don't apply anymore, and in fact, has been um, at the heart. That question has been at the heart of many a discussion of Jewish law, especially in the conservative movement. In other words, what continues to apply, what continues to not apply. Um, uh, you know, Look, I would say that uh, I will give you an example, right? And it's an example that has a lot of different implications, and this is probably an oversimplification of it. But when the conservative movement said in the 1950s, when at least there were some conservative authorities that said, um, if you do not live within walking distance of a synagogue, and it's the Sabbath and Shabbat, it is better to drive to and from synagogue to attend services and potentially break certain rules in terms of other rules that have to do with observing the Sabbath. It is better to drive to services because it is better to be part of a community, because the other alternative is to stay at home and to not attend services at synagogue. An Orthodox answer to that question, at least in terms of, should I drive to synagogue or not? The answer, at least in terms of proper observance, is no, because there are things that happen in the operation of a vehicle that are, as Orthodox understand it, violations of the rules of the Sabbath to not work. So Orthodox would say better to stay home. Conservative movement has, in general, said, no, it's better to be part of a community. That is better in terms of the overall Sabbath experience, even if it means, there may be a violation here or there of work on the Sabbath. What does that have to do with the question of what laws apply or not? The reason why the conservative movement made this declaration, a big reason, is because starting in the 1950s with the explosion of suburbia, people didn't live. There were a lot of Jews who didn't live within walking distance of their synagogues anymore. It just became a practical impossibility for them to do that. Or they could have chosen to live close to a synagogue and close enough to walk. However, the housing may have been so prohibitively expensive that they couldn't do anything else. In other words, the idea that we are all living walking distance from everything we need in the Jewish community is an idea that in most places doesn't apply anymore. It just doesn't. And so that was an example of some people in the conservative movement saying, all right, if you need to drive, then drive. By the way, there are conservative Jews who say, you know what, still not good enough. We have to walk to services. Right. That's still that there's certainly a strand of the movement that finds that important. And and that's part of it. Does that, I know there's a lot in that question. Does that help answer it?
Yeah, I think you talked about the laws towards man to man and laws man to God. I think that helped differentiate, I think, what you're saying. And yeah, I think there's just a whole lot more I don't understand that I'll maybe ask more questions over time.
Please do. By the way, I mean, it's one of the challenges in general of doing an introductory level Judaism classes because, you want to, it's like I want to tell you guys everything, right? I want to tell you guys everything, but where to begin? And I think no matter where you begin, there are certain there's no matter I think where you begin, there's always an assumption of, oh, this thing I'm going to tell you, it really helps if you know two or three other things before I tell you this one thing. And so I appreciate in advance everybody's willingness to kind of stick with it, as there are going to be certain things where, in certain bits of information where it's like, I'm not able to explain it right away, but I'll get to it. I promise I'll get to it. Okay. Anything
Rabbi?
else? Please.
Yeah. Are this is your opinion, or where are you getting this stuff, particularly about reform? Because it seems like the first thing on progressive revelation, first sentence on that, and then on a party, that's pretty contradictory. It seems like that one should be the same as one of the conservative one. That the Torah was written by humans, but it was inspired by God. And otherwise, why is one in a party even in there then?
It's a very good question. So again, in terms of where I got this chart, this is from Elliot Dorff's book, From Our Ancestors to Our Descendants, which is a meant to be sort of like a workbook and textbook to introduce people to the ideas of the conservative movement. And it was written, I believe, in the early 1990s, either that late 80s, something like that. So that's where I got it from. And in terms of the question of, moral laws come from God, ritual laws have no authority. Here is, I would say, the main difference, at least philosophically, between conservative and Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism says that we are not bound by Jewish ritual law. We often celebrate plenty of things in it, but we are not bound by it. It's not something that is, it's not something that we have to do. The conservative movement, at least philosophically, says we are bound by traditional Jewish law. Now,
Well, you're missing my point though. If moral laws come from God, then why isn't the Torah like one the books have inspired by God? That's my understanding. Of course, I don't claim to be near as knowledgeable. That's what I've always understood. I didn't think there was a conflict with whether it was God dictated or it was dictated to Moses, or whether it was inspired by Moses or a bunch of it. But it's completely leaving out the inspiration of God. So that just seems like contradictory to me. I mean,
and fair enough, right? So the question of, right, like, well, in other words, like, if God didn't write the Torah, but yet morals come from God, how can that be? Is that sort of essentially where you're at?
right. It seems like that's contradictory.
Oh, fair enough. So I think an answer that a Reformed Jew would an educated Reformed Jew might give is what was in this part here. Sorry, I'll circle this again. From this box here, the idea of progressive revelation, that as time goes on, we get to understand God's will better and better. Meaning, like, so the response is essentially that we know things about the world, we know things about life in general that our ancestors from thousands of years ago just didn't know. Just didn't they didn't know it scientifically, they didn't know it philosophically, whatever it might be. So, in other words, how can moral laws come from God when, if God didn't actually write the Torah, or if the events of the Torah were not, could not be proven to happen literally? The answer they would give is that as we understand the world better, we understand God's will better. That might not be a perfect answer, or certainly doesn't have to be an answer that satisfies, your understanding. But I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of what a Reformed Jew might say.
I don't claim to be educated, but I was taught to be Jewish as a Reformed Jew. And that's contrary to whatever I've ever been taught or learned, that, yeah, I go along with the other step, but it's kind of like, well, maybe it is, maybe it is. But the Torah to me is definitely comes at least inspired by God, and it doesn't really matter if he did it like in the Ten Commandments movie, he wrote it on the thing, but that is the basic moral laws, and that was certainly to me inspired by God. And not saying you, but I think this author is writing it from a non-reformed Jew's viewpoint.
And that's a very fair suggestion. And I'll, I mean, and I would, and by the way, like, I want to be sensitive to that, and perhaps there can be an opportunity for, at some future point to, to have a discussion with somebody from the Reform movement who can, could probably describe things better than I can, or at least better than what's put into this little box. But look, fair questions and fair critiques, and so it's okay. If we can kind of park that for now, because I do want to get um, into some of the ideas for the conservative movement. So what I was kind of beginning to describe there, about the differences between reform and conservative. The conservative movement says we are indeed bound by Jewish law, right? In other words, ritual laws still apply to us. Now, does every conservative Jew follow every single thing? No. And and again, we're talking about the philosophy behind it. We're not necessarily talking about the literal actual performance. But so let me go through like a couple of different options regarding the way that different conservative Jews understand what happened in Mount Sinai. So one is this idea that it's a version of continuous revelation. In other words, what happened in Mount Sinai? Definitely something. And is it close to what actually happened? Probably. Meaning God dictated God's will at Sinai and other times. However, it was written down by human beings, and therefore there are things in the Bible that are, biblical traditions. There are descriptions of biblical traditions that do not necessarily align. Right? There are numerous, to say the least, inconsistencies within the Torah. And so how do you understand that? How does one understand that? You understand it is that human beings wrote it down. I liken this to this idea to a press conference. Think about a press conference in which journalists would stand around a person who's making a big announcement or whatever it is, and imagine that happening in the days before recording devices. Before you had you could do audio recordings, video recordings. Just imagine a group of reporters surrounding like with pads, with pen and paper while somebody was talking. The odds of those reporters going back and each writing the same story are almost nil, because we're human beings. Odds are a handful of people are going to not quote exactly accurately. Odds are some people are going to say, well, this quote was more important than that quote. The stories are going to be a little different because we're human beings. We're flawed. And we have different ways of approaching things. So what happened at Mount Sinai? Probably a lot of what is described there, but maybe not every jot and tittle is necessarily that way. Now, another approach to what happened at Mount Sinai: human beings wrote the Torah, but they were divinely inspired. So what happened at Mount Sinai? Hard to know. But the people who wrote this story of Mount Sinai were inspired by God. In other words, there is some sort of godly hand, if you will, in it. Again, this is another approach within the conservative movement. There's no one absolute way to look at it. And then you have another idea of continuous revelation, The Torah is the human record of the encounter between God and the people Israel at Sinai. Since it was written by human beings, it contains some laws and ideas which we find repugnant today. I will give you what is my favorite example of this. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says at one point that if your teenage child were to basically badmouth you and badmouth God, you are supposed to take that child into the town square, announce the dastardly thing that that child has done, and then instruct everyone in the town to stone that child to death. That is in the book of Deuteronomy. We don't do that today. Some of us parents of teenagers might want to once in a while, but we don't because it's wrong, right? I mean, this idea is wrong. I'm saying this as a 21st century Jew, a 21st century human being. Don't do that. Well, how do you get from point A to point B, though?
How do you get from the 10 Commandment that says thou shalt not murder to Deuteronomy instructing you to go do that to your child?
I would say that the answer that the Torah might provide, and please understand, I am not defending this. The answer that the Torah might provide is it's that commandment, thou shalt, is that specifically thou shalt not murder. It's not thou shalt not kill. And therefore, this is essentially, they would say that one would say, oh, well, the case of the teenage child, this is capital punishment. It's not, you're not murdering the person. The person has done has done an offense that needs to be punished via capital measures. Please understand, I'm not defending this practice whatsoever. But I think that's how the Torah might, if the Torah were a personified being, that's probably how they would answer. So what does all that mean? In other words, if you have this situation where God and human beings are, to an extent, partners in creating the narrative that is the story of Mount Sinai, what do we do then? How do we live as Jews if that's the case? The answer is complex, and there are multiple answers, of course. But we arrive at this place where we still find the traditions in the Torah, by and large, sacred and meaningful. Not necessarily every word, not necessarily every law, but the overall idea, the overall set of ideas and values are compelling and important to follow. However, because there's this idea of human and godly partnership, we do have, to an extent, a certain amount of license to reevaluate how to live as Jews in our modern times. It means we keep traditions that are important, and we keep as many of them as we are able. However, not every tradition applies to modern days. So again, the reason I wanted to start with this is, sorry, I'm gonna just erase this. I think I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. So the reason I wanted to start with this, and I know we're pretty much out of time here, but it's the idea that what we have in our tradition is a very rich tapestry of laws, traditions, and philosophies. And depending on how we understand the beginnings of those traditions, has a lot to do with how we approach them in our modern day and age. So I know I've given a lot of ideas and a lot of some of them perhaps more complicated than others. I invite you to be in touch with me as you need. Yeah, the difference between murder and killing, I would say murder is, like cold-blooded, like saying, okay, I don't like this person or what they're doing or whatever it is, I'm going to kill them, as opposed to killing, which can sometimes be in self-defense, that can sometimes be in the course of war or other regrettable things that we sometimes must do, in terms of defending ourselves or what have you. So it's a broader definition. Again, not
Right.
excusing one or the other.
Thank you.
So that's how I'd like to continue. So please be in touch with me when and if you have questions between now and next Sunday. And we're going to take a pretty more basic tact next time. But I wanted to kind of start with this challenge of basically saying that there are a lot of ways to approach Jewish life, Jewish living, and the ways we approach it are often informed with how we understand what our responsibilities and opportunities are. So I thank everybody for your attention, for your interest. I hope you join us next week, and of course, as we go week to week, if you can't make it a certain week, again, I'll stream on YouTube, and I'll send links and do all the things. So I hope that everybody has a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Hope to see
Yeah.
you soon.
I won't be available next week. We're moving. But
Okay.
I think I'll probably check out the video and hopefully join the following week. So,
Terrific. Terrific. Glad to have